August 9, 1945. A prisoner of war camp in rural Pennsylvania. The mess hall at Camp Allegheny fell silent as American kitchen staff carried out dozens of plates bearing something the German women prisoners had never seen before. Cherry pie, its crimson filling glistening beneath the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, topped with a generous scoop of vanilla ice cream that was already beginning to melt into pale rivers across the golden crust. The sight stopped conversations mid-sentence. Forks clattered against tin plates. 27 German women, members of the Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final chaotic weeks of the European War, stared at the desserts being placed before them with expressions that ranged from confusion to something approaching disbelief. Gisela Hartmann, 23 years old and formerly of Bremen, watched the ice cream slowly dissolve into the warm pie filling and felt something catch in her throat. She had not cried since her capture 3 months earlier. She had not allowed herself that weakness. But looking at this simple American dessert, abundant and carelessly generous, she felt tears threatening to break through her carefully maintained composure. Beside her, Marlies Brandt from Lübeck touched the edge of her plate with one finger, as if testing whether the food was real. Across the table, young Anneliese Vogel, barely 19, whispered in German, "Is this truly for us?" Captain Harriet Pembroke stood at the front of the mess hall, her uniform crisp despite the August heat, watching the prisoners' reactions with an expression that suggested she had not quite expected this response. She had authorized the special dessert as part of a delayed 4th of July celebration, thinking it a small gesture of normalcy during the strange limbo period as the War Department processed repatriation procedures. She had not anticipated that cherry pie would produce what looked remarkably like shock. Corporal Vincent Palmieri, a 24-year-old guard from Rhode Island, whose own grandmother had arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but hope and determination, moved quietly between the tables. "Go ahead," he said gently in English to the women who seemed frozen. "It's cherry pie a la mode. That means with ice cream." Delphine Rousseau, the head cook whose Louisiana Creole family knew something about feeding people with love and intention, watched from the kitchen doorway. She had made this pie the same way she made everything, with care, with generosity, and with the belief that food could speak truths that words could not. She saw Gisela lift her fork with trembling hands. The first taste hit Gisela like a memory of something she had never actually experienced. Sweet and tart simultaneously, cold cream melting against warm fruit, buttery crust dissolving on her tongue. It tasted like abundance. It tasted like a world where such things were normal, expected, unremarkable. It tasted like everything she had been told about America was a lie. Around the mess hall, similar revelations were occurring. Some women ate slowly, reverently. Others wept openly. What could possibly make a simple dessert produce such profound reactions? Before we discover what brought these women to this moment, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 3 months earlier, on May 14, 1945, when a military transport truck rumbled through the Pennsylvania countryside carrying its unusual cargo. Gisela Hartmann sat in the back with 26 other German women, their hands unbound, but their futures entirely uncertain. The war in Europe had ended just 6 days earlier, but for these members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, Victory Day had meant only the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. They had been captured in France during the final weeks of combat, serving in various support roles for retreating Wehrmacht units. Radio operators, medical assistants, administrative clerks, none of them had fired weapons, but all of them wore the gray uniforms that marked them as part of Germany's military machine. Now those uniforms were dirty and torn, their insignia hastily removed by American soldiers who seemed unsure how to process female prisoners of war. Gisela had spent the ocean crossing trying to prepare herself for what propaganda had taught her to expect. Americans were brutal, she had been told. They showed no mercy to German soldiers. The stories had been specific and terrifying, designed to prevent surrender, to keep German forces fighting even when defeat was inevitable. She had half believed them during the war. Now, sitting in the truck driving through green hills that reminded her painfully of the German countryside, she was about to discover which stories were true. Camp Allegheny appeared suddenly as the truck rounded a bend. It was smaller than the massive POW facilities she had heard about, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by a wire fence that looked almost casual compared to the fortifications she had expected. Guard towers stood at the corners, but they seemed somehow less menacing than she had imagined. The American flag hung limply in the still May air. Captain Harriet Pembroke stood waiting as the truck came to a halt. At 38, she was a career officer who had volunteered for this assignment specifically because she believed women prisoners required female oversight. She had spent 2 weeks preparing the facility, converting what had been a small training camp into something appropriate for housing female POWs. She had no handbook for this. No one did. The United States had never before held German women as prisoners of war. The women climbed down from the truck stiffly, their legs cramped from the long journey. Gisela noticed how young Corporal Vincent Palmieri seemed as he stood near the gate, his rifle held loosely, almost casually. His dark eyes met hers, briefly, and she saw something she had not expected. Not hatred, not even cold military professionalism, something closer to curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. Captain Pembroke addressed them in clear, slow English that Gisela could partially understand from her school studies. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," she said. "You will be fed, housed, and given medical care. You will work, but you will not be mistreated." Marlies Brandt whispered in German beside Gisela, "Do you believe her?" Gisela did not answer. She did not know what to believe anymore. The mess hall smelled like nothing Gisela had encountered in 2 years. Rich, savory, abundant. The scent of roasting meat and fresh bread, and something else she could not immediately identify, something that spoke of kitchens where food was plentiful enough to be seasoned with more than desperation. The German women filed in for their first meal at Camp Allegheny with the mechanical movements of people who had learned not to expect much from life. Delphine Rousseau watched them from behind the serving counter, her experienced eyes taking in the signs she had learned to recognize during years of feeding people. The hollow cheeks, the way their uniforms hung loose on frames that should have carried more weight, the particular alertness of people who had been hungry for a long time. She had seen it before in her own community during the hard years of the Depression. She recognized hunger that went beyond a few missed meals. The menu that evening was simple by American standards. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, fresh rolls with butter, and canned peaches for dessert. Nothing fancy, nothing exotic, just good, solid food in quantities that Delphine considered normal. She began filling plates with her usual generous portions. Gisela reached the front of the line and found herself staring at the plate being offered to her. The chicken leg was golden and crispy, still steaming. The mound of mashed potatoes was larger than any portion she had seen since before the war began. Real butter, not the ersatz margarine that had become standard in Germany, sat melting into the bread. She took the plate with both hands, afraid she might drop it. Around her, similar reactions were unfolding. Irmgard Schroeder, 27 years old and from Kiel, stood holding her tray as if it were something precious and fragile. Anneliese Vogel's eyes had gone wide, her young face showing unconcealed shock. Marlies Brandt moved through the line in a daze, accepting each item placed on her plate with the stunned expression of someone watching an impossible magic trick. Opal Hendricks, the kitchen assistant from Tennessee, noticed Annaliese's trembling hands. "Honey," she said gently, her southern accent soft, "you sit down now before you drop that plate. Go on." The women sat at the long tables in clusters, their German conversations hushed and urgent. Gisela cut. into her chicken and found it tender, the meat falling easily from the bone. The taste was simple but overwhelming. Salt and pepper and herbs she could not name, fat and flavor and abundance. She had not eaten chicken in more than a year. In Bremen, toward the war's end, they had been lucky to have potatoes and bread. Meat had become a distant memory. Marlies was crying silently, tears running down her face as she ate. Irmgard ate slowly, methodically, as if afraid the food might vanish if she acknowledged how desperately she wanted it. Across the mess hall, Corporal Palmieri watched them with an expression of dawning understanding. Whatever these women had expected from American captivity, it had not been this. The days following that first meal established a rhythm that continued to confuse every expectation the German women had carried with them into captivity. They woke to breakfast that included eggs and toast and coffee that tasted like actual coffee rather than the roasted grain substitute that had become standard in wartime Germany. They worked in the camp, laundry, the gardens, and various maintenance duties, but the work was neither punishing nor cruel. And 3 times each day, they returned to the mess hall where Delphine Rousseau continued to serve portions that seemed impossible. Gisela noticed that Delphine watched them carefully during meals, her dark eyes missing nothing. When the cook saw that Irmgard consistently finished everything on her plate and still looked hungry, the portions quietly grew larger. When Annalisa struggled with the unfamiliar American foods, Delphine began adding items she thought the young woman might find more familiar. A simple potato soup one day, dark bread instead of white rolls another. "That one's too thin," Delphine told Opal Hendricks one morning as they prepared breakfast. She nodded toward Marlies, who had always been slight but now looked almost fragile. "She needs building up. Give her extra butter, extra everything. Don't make a fuss about it, just do it." Opal nodded, understanding without needing explanation. She had grown up poor in the Tennessee mountains, had known what it meant to watch children go hungry. These German women might have been enemies a few weeks ago, but hunger was hunger, and feeding people was simply what you did when you had the means. Corporal Palmieri found his own ways of building bridges. During his rounds of the compound, he began carrying photographs from home. His grandmother's journey from Sicily, arriving at Ellis Island at age 16, with nothing but courage and hope. His family's grocery store in Providence, built from that courage through decades of hard work. He showed these pictures to the prisoners who seemed interested, using simple words and hand gestures to communicate across the language barrier. Gisela found herself drawn to these informal exchanges. Her English was improving rapidly, necessity being an effective teacher. She began to understand that Palmieri was showing them something important, that he came from immigrants, from people who had also been foreign and frightened and hoping for better, that perhaps America's story was more complicated than the propaganda posters had suggested. One evening in early June, Opal found Annalise sitting alone near the barracks, looking lost. The girl was homesick, that much was obvious, though she tried to hide it behind stoic German reserve. Opal sat down beside her without asking permission and began teaching her English words. Simple things: sky tree, bird, friend. The Tennessee woman's patience was infinite, her voice gentle. And when Annalisa finally smiled at successfully pronouncing a difficult word, Opal patted her hand with casual affection. These were small gestures, unremarkable individually, a larger portion of food, a photograph shared, a language lesson given freely. But accumulated over weeks, they began to crack something fundamental in the German women's understanding of who their enemies were supposed to be. The 4th of July fell on a Wednesday that year, but supply delays meant Camp Allegheny's celebration was postponed until the following Thursday, August 9th. Captain Pembroke had debated whether to include the German prisoners in the festivities at all. The war had been over for 3 months, but these women were still technically enemy prisoners, awaiting repatriation orders that seemed perpetually delayed by bureaucratic confusion in Washington. Including them in an American patriotic celebration felt strange, potentially inappropriate. Yet excluding them felt unnecessarily cruel. She compromised by ordering a special meal without the overt patriotic elements. No flags in the mess hall, no speeches about American victory, just good food. The kind of abundant celebration meal that marked important occasions. Delphine had outdone herself. Fried chicken again, this time accompanied by corn on the cob, coleslaw made with vinegar and sugar, baked beans rich with molasses, and fresh biscuits that steamed when broken open. But the real centerpiece, the item that Delphine had spent 2 days preparing, was dessert. 27 cherry pies lined the kitchen counter, their lattice crusts golden and perfect, the filling visible through the woven pastry like jewels behind a gate. Beside them sat 5 gallons of vanilla ice cream, kept frozen through careful management of the camp's limited ice supply. Delphine had learned to make cherry pie from her own grandmother, who had learned it from a German immigrant neighbor in New Orleans decades earlier. The irony of serving German prisoners a recipe that had crossed the Atlantic generations ago was not lost on her. When the prisoners finished their main course, Opal and 2 other kitchen assistants began carrying out the desserts. The first plate reached Gisela's table, and the reaction was immediate. Marley's actually gasped audibly. Irmgard's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, forgotten. Annalisa stared at the pie as if it might be a mirage that would vanish if she blinked. The ice cream was already melting, creating small white pools that seeped into the pie's crimson filling. The combination of colors alone seemed almost obscene in its beauty. Red and white and gold, vibrant and rich, and utterly impossible. Gisela picked up her fork and then set it down again, overwhelmed by something she could not immediately name. Around the mess hall, similar scenes were unfolding. Women who had maintained stoic military bearing for months were openly weeping at the sight of dessert. Others laughed with a slightly hysterical edge, the sound of people confronting something so far beyond their expectations that the only response was absurd joy. One woman, a former nurse named Petra from Stuttgart, put her face in her hands and sobbed. Captain Pembroke exchanged glances with Corporal Palmieri, both of them unsettled by the intensity of the response. They had expected the prisoners to enjoy the treat, perhaps to be grateful. They had not expected this raw, overwhelming emotion. Delphine stood in the kitchen doorway, witnessing the scene she had created, and understood something the others did not quite grasp yet. This was not about pie. This was about everything that pie represented. The ice cream melted completely before Gisela took her first bite. She had been staring at the dessert for nearly 2 minutes, trying to reconcile what sat before her with everything she thought she understood about the world. When she finally lifted her fork, the taste triggered something unexpected. Not just pleasure at the sweetness, though that was overwhelming enough after years of sugar rationing, but memory. A specific memory of her mother's kitchen in Bremen before the war, when such abundance had seemed ordinary and unremarkable. She began to cry. Not the silent tears she had shed at previous meals, but open, gasping sobs that shook her shoulders and made it impossible to continue eating. Marley's reached over and gripped her hand tightly. But Marley's was crying too, and across the table Annalise had given up any pretense of composure. Around the mess hall, 27 German women were falling apart over cherry pie. Opal Hendricks approached their table cautiously, concerned that something was wrong with the food. "Honey, are you all right?" she asked Gisela, her Tennessee accent soft with genuine worry. "Is the pie not good?" Gisela looked up at her through tears and tried to find English words adequate to explain. "It is too good," she managed finally, her accent thick with emotion. "We have not had such things in so long. In Germany at the end, we had nothing, nothing. And here you give us this, and we are prisoners, and you are supposed to hate us." The words tumbled out in a mixture of English and German, aided by hand gestures and Marley's attempts at translation. Other women at nearby tables began adding their own voices to the conversation, Irmgard described the last winter of the war in Kiel, when they had eaten nothing but turnips and black bread for weeks at a time. Annalisa talked about watching children in her neighborhood grow thin and hollow-eyed, about the way hunger had become so constant that you stopped really feeling it and simply existed in a permanent state of emptiness. Corporal Palmieri had drifted closer, listening to the fractured English and emotional German with growing understanding. "We didn't know it was that bad," he said quietly. "I mean, we knew Germany was losing, that there were shortages, but we didn't understand how bad the hunger was for regular people." Gisela wiped her eyes with her napkin and forced herself to take another bite of pie. The sweetness was almost painful against her tongue, too intense after years of deprivation. "We were told Americans were starving too," she said. "That your cities were bombed, that you had nothing, that you were desperate. They told us we were fighting to protect Germany from people who wanted to destroy us completely. And now we sit in your prison and you give us chicken and ice cream and cherry pie like it costs nothing." The conversation continued long after the desserts were finished. Long after the mess hall should have been cleared for cleanup, Captain Pembroke, recognizing something important was happening, allowed it to continue. 2 days after the cherry pie incident, Gisela approached Captain Pembroke with a carefully rehearsed request. Her English had improved dramatically over 3 months, aided by necessity and by the informal lessons Opal continued to provide during meal times. "Captain," she said, her accent still thick, but her words clear, "some of us would like to help in the kitchen, to work with Miss Rousseau and Miss Hendricks, to learn and also to be useful." Captain Pembroke considered the request carefully. Allowing prisoners into the kitchen meant trusting them with knives, with hot stoves, with access to the camp's food supplies. It represented a level of confidence that seemed at odds with their official status as enemy prisoners of war. Yet she had watched these women over the past months, had seen how the initial defiance and fear had transformed into something approaching genuine cooperation. "I'll discuss it with Miss Rousseau," she said finally. "If she agrees, we can arrange it." Delphine's response was immediate and characteristically direct. "Those girls need something to do besides laundry and weeding gardens," she told the captain. "They need to learn something useful, and Lord knows I could use the help. Opal and I have been working ourselves half to death feeding this whole camp. Send me the ones who seem interested and responsible. I'll teach them." The following Monday, Gisela, Marlies, and 3 other German women reported to the kitchen at 5 in the morning. Delphine set them to work immediately, showing them how to crack eggs in quantity sufficient to feed 80 people, how to mix biscuit dough that would be light and flaky, how to portion bacon so that everyone received fair shares. The work was hot and demanding, starting before dawn and continuing through breakfast cleanup, resuming again for lunch preparation. But something happened in that kitchen that went beyond simple food preparation. Delphine taught them recipes while telling them stories about her grandmother, who had been enslaved in Louisiana, who had learned to create extraordinary meals from the limited ingredients available to her, about her mother, who had cooked in white people's homes to support her family, who had learned that feeding people with love and attention was its own form of dignity and resistance, about her own journey to become a head cook in a military facility, a position rarely held by a woman, never mind a Creole woman. Gisela listened while learning to make cornbread, the particular texture of the meal between her fingers, foreign but becoming familiar. She began to understand that Delphine was teaching them more than recipes. She was teaching them about abundance as a choice, about generosity as a form of strength rather than weakness. In Germany, scarcity had been weaponized, had been used to justify cruelty and competition. Here in this Pennsylvania kitchen, Delphine was demonstrating a different philosophy entirely. Marlies discovered she had a talent for pastry, her careful attention to detail perfect for the precise measurements baking required. Opal taught her how to make pie crust, the cold butter cut into flour until it resembled coarse meal, the ice water added drop by drop until the dough just came together. The letter arrived for Irmgard Schroeder on a Tuesday morning in late August, forwarded through the International Red Cross after months of delay. She held the thin envelope with trembling hands, recognizing her aunt's handwriting on the address. It was the first communication she had received from Germany since her capture, the first confirmation that anyone from her previous life still existed. She opened it standing in the common room while other women watched, understanding the weight of such moments. The contents were brief, written in the cramped script of someone conserving precious paper. Irmgard read in silence, her face draining of color with each line. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and walked outside without speaking to anyone. Gisela found her 20 minutes later, sitting behind the barracks, staring at nothing. "They are all dead," Irmgard said in German, her voice flat and emotionless. "My mother, my father, my 2 brothers. The bombing of Kiel in April, direct hit on the shelter where they had gone. My aunt survived because she was in Hamburg visiting relatives. Everyone else is gone." She looked at Gisela with eyes that seemed to have aged years in minutes. "I have been sitting here trying to feel something, grief, anger, anything, but I feel nothing, just empty." The news from Germany had been arriving in pieces throughout August, each letter bringing fresh devastation. Anneliese learned that her entire neighborhood in her small town near Hanover no longer existed, destroyed in the final weeks of the war. Marlies received word that her father had died of starvation in the brutal winter of 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Others heard nothing at all, which in many ways was worse than bad news. The silence suggested there was no one left to write. But it was not just personal losses that arrived in those letters. The broader truth about Germany's actions during the war had begun to emerge in undeniable detail. American newspapers published photographs from liberated concentration camps, images so horrific that many readers assumed they must be propaganda. Captain Pembroke, after careful consideration, made these newspapers available to the German prisoners. They deserved to know, she reasoned, what their country had done in their names. Gisela sat in the camp library reading accounts of Buchenwald, of Dachau, of Bergen-Belsen. The descriptions were clinical and precise, which somehow made them more horrible. Numbers that were incomprehensible, methods that were systematic and deliberate. She read about gas chambers disguised as showers, about medical experiments, about the murder of children. Her hands shook so badly she had to set the newspaper down. Marlies found her there and picked up a different paper. They read in silence, occasionally translating difficult English words for each other, helping each other comprehend the incomprehensible. Other women joined them, drawn by some unspoken summons. They needed to face this together, to witness what they had been part of, however unknowingly. "We did not know," Anneliese whispered finally, her young face stricken. "I swear to you, we did not know these things were happening." Gisela looked at her with something like pity. "Does that matter?" she asked quietly. "We did not know because we did not ask, because we chose to believe the comfortable lies instead of questioning what our government was doing." September 5, 1945. Captain Pembroke stood before the assembled German prisoners holding official orders from the War Department. Repatriation procedures had finally been finalized. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in occupied Germany before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. As she read the orders aloud, translating key passages into simplified English for those still struggling with the language, she watched the women's faces carefully. She expected relief, perhaps some anxiety about the journey, but fundamentally relief at the prospect of going home after months of captivity. What she saw instead was something far more complicated. Fear, certainly, but also something that looked disturbingly like grief. That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks for a meeting that stretched past midnight. They spoke in rapid German, voices rising and falling with emotion, as they debated the question that had been building for weeks. What did they want to return to? The Germany they had served no longer existed. The values they thought they had been defending had been revealed as lies built on unimaginable atrocities. Many of them had no families left to return to, no homes still standing, no clear purpose waiting for them. Meanwhile, here in this strange Pennsylvania prison camp, they had found something unexpected. Work that gave them purpose and dignity. People who treated them with kindness despite having every reason to hate them. A community that had somehow formed across the lines that were supposed to divide enemies permanently. Delphine had been teaching them not just to cook, but to understand abundance as something to be shared rather than hoarded. Opal had been showing them that different did not mean dangerous. Corporal Palmieri had demonstrated that former enemies could become something approaching friends. Gisela emerged as the unofficial spokesperson for a group that had reached a consensus. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Captain Pembroke. 6 other women accompanied her, including Marlies and Annalisa. They had rehearsed what to say, but the actual words still felt impossible to speak aloud. "Captain," Gisela began, her English now fluent enough to convey complex thoughts, "we have discussed the repatriation orders extensively. Some of us, we wish to make an unusual request." She paused, gathering courage. "We would like permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Pembroke stared at them as if she had misheard. "You want to remain in captivity?" she asked carefully. "Rather than accept your freedom?" "We do not think of it as captivity anymore," Marley said quietly. "We think of it as sanctuary." Annalisa, speaking up for the first time in such a formal setting, added in halting English, "In Germany we have nothing to return to, no family, no homes. And we will be hated there, seen as failures, as women who were captured and corrupted. Here, we have found people who see us as human beings capable of change." Captain Pembroke struggled to process what she was hearing. The legal implications alone were staggering. These were enemy prisoners of war, 1965. 20 years after the war ended. Gisela Hartmann stood in her bakery on Main Street in the small Pennsylvania town that had become her home, sliding a fresh cherry pie into the display case. The filling glistened exactly the way Delphine had taught her 2 decades earlier, the lattice crust golden and perfect. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the window. Inside, the scent of baking bread and cinnamon filled the warm air. The bell above the door chimed, and Gisela looked up to see a familiar face. Irmgard Schroeder, older now with gray streaking her dark hair, stood smiling in the doorway. She had returned to Germany in 1945, determined to help rebuild despite having lost everything. Now she worked as a social worker in Hamburg, helping refugees displaced by various conflicts find new homes. She was visiting America for a conference on international aid. "Gisela," Irmgard said, embracing her old friend, "the bakery is beautiful, just as I imagined from your letters." They sat at a small table near the window, and Gisela brought out 2 slices of cherry pie, each topped with vanilla ice cream. Irmgard laughed. "Still making this after all these years?" "Every day," Gisela confirmed. "It is my most popular item. People come from 3 towns over for it. They have no idea why this particular recipe matters so much to me." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, 20 years of separate lives falling away. Finally, Irmgard spoke. "Do you ever regret staying, choosing America over going home?" Gisela considered carefully. "I think we both made the right choices for ourselves. You returned and helped rebuild something better from the ruins. I stayed and learned what it means to be part of a country that believes in second chances. Germany needed people like you. America needed people like me to prove that redemption was possible." Marlies had married an American soldier and now lived in Ohio with 3 children. Annalisa had become a teacher, educating American children about the dangers of hatred and propaganda. Each woman who had chosen to stay had found her own way to honor the unexpected kindness they had received. "Delphine?" Irmgard asked. "Still cooking at the Veterans Hospital 2 towns over. She is 70 now but refuses to retire, says feeding people is what keeps her alive. Gisela smiled. She comes here every Sunday after church. We make her grandmother's recipes together. Outside, customers were beginning to line up for the lunch rush. Gisela stood, preparing to return to work, but she paused, looking at the cherry pie in the display case. "We came here as enemies," she said quietly. "We expected cruelty and found abundance. We expected hatred and found humanity. That pie, that simple dessert on one August afternoon, showed us that everything we had been taught was a lie. It showed us what grace looks like." Irmgard nodded, understanding. "And we both spent 20 years trying to pass that grace forward.